All right, welcome Naka Seniors to Unit 2, Intro to Biodiversity. And here's just a little picture to get your mind, the wheels turning. Out of all of the weight of different organisms on the Earth, you see that these would be humans, these dark squares. These green squares would be all of the other animals in the world, wild animals. And these lighter squares would be our different animals: pigs, goats, sheep, and cattle. So most of the animals in the world are our food animals, believe it or not. So please follow this lecture with your guided notes and pause the video whenever you need. Make sure that you understand everything. Anything that you don't understand, please shoot me a message and let's connect. All right, so biodiversity, it's the variety of life on Earth. It's all of the different life forms that we see. It's a very beautiful subject. And our learning objectives are that ecosystems have structure and diversity that change over time. And we want to know how to explain levels of biodiversity and their importance to ecosystems. And this is chapters 4.2 and 4.3 in the text. I'll provide that for you for extra support. Okay, so we have 3 scales of biodiversity, and meaning that we have diversity in different levels in the environment. Okay, so genetic diversity is genetic variation among individuals in a population. Okay, so population includes members of the same species. Okay, so genetics is anything that you got from your parents, as a reminder. So skin color is an example of a human trait that varies because of genetics. And yeah, so like in a population, it's like how many have blue eyes? How many have brown hair? That would be the genetic diversity. Okay. And these are the things that put stress in the environment. So there are things that drive genetic diversity and evolution. So which traits are passed on to their children. And so for skin color, for example, it would be the amount of vitamin D needed and protection from UV radiation. That's what gives people darker skin. It's more contact with sun, right? And so physical stress, like natural disasters, would cause a population to change. Wildfires, pollution, thermal stress, so heat, radiation, climatic, light and temperature, and biological pressures. So predation, competition amongst organisms, parasitism, when a parasite is feeding off of you and not giving anything in return, or a lack of mates. So these are all the things that affect the gene pool, or the traits that are passed from parents to offspring. Okay. So on your own in your packet, what would enable a population to bounce back more easily or have more resilience after environmental stress or disturbance? High or low genetic diversity? Explain why with an example. So pause the video and try to answer. So genetic diversity would mean a lot of different types of traits. So like if a big population of animals had a lot of different colors, or there was a lot of different types of genes or traits, physical traits, right? So pause the video and go ahead and answer that. Okay, so hopefully you pause the video, but higher genetic diversity is much better because there's more likely to be advantageous genes present that protect individuals and give them a better chance of survival. So for example, a field of crops would all be killed by one pest or pathogen if there are not some that are resistant. So if you have just one type of corn in the field and they're all susceptible to one disease, it will kill everything, compared to a lot of different types, a lot of diversity. Also, some trees that can survive better in the heat than others could withstand climate change longer. And animals that have better camouflage might not be overhunted, right? If they constantly are able to camouflage better, then they might survive better and then reproduce more, okay? And they might maybe have a lot of diversity, like a lot of different colors that mix into different environments, and so that organism would likely survive more, right? So we have the bottleneck effect. And this is when a drastic and sudden reduction in the size of a population leads to a change in the gene pool. So basically, here's the original population. There's the bottleneck event. So let's say a wildfire or a volcano explodes. So anything that's a big event. Then the surviving population has only these genes, these traits. Okay? And then the new population is less diverse. So it can weaken the population, right? So let's say, for example, you have a population of insects that are a bunch of different colors in the forest, right? And so some are green and they camouflage on the leaves, and some are red and they camouflage on the rocks. And so they have a lot of diversity. Then all of a sudden a huge wildfire, like we see in Oregon right now, and it kills off a lot of the insects, and all we have left are the white ones because they were in one place, a different area. All of a sudden those are a lot more vulnerable to getting eaten because they don't have all the different traits, the different colors that they could be camouflaging with. All right? So this might not be totally random and not because the surviving genes had any advantage. In this graphic you can see that randomly a few more red genes survived, and so when the population built up again, it had a much higher proportion of red genes as opposed to yellow. So try to think of some more different events that could do that. It could be human caused, could be storms, pollution, an oil spill, volcano, overhunting, habitat destruction. It would skew the population to be a certain type more often. Okay, and species diversity is the number of species in a region or habitat in a community or ecosystem. So if we were going to go take a study on this, we would go and take random traps, and we would see all the different species that we found. And the number of different types is how diverse it is. So these are the diversity of organisms in the world. So you can see that much of the planet is insects, and animals are only less than a quarter of the diversity of organisms. Insects are huge, and plants, obviously. But we have no real idea of how many species there are, and every time a scientist goes to the Amazon and gasses a tree, identifies everything that falls out of its branches, dozens of new insect species are identified. A quarter of all named species are beetles. So there's a quote, "God has an inordinate fondness for beetles." There's just so many different types, and you could, even in New Mexico, you could probably discover a new type of beetle, which is pretty cool. So a species can interbreed and produce viable offspring. So if two species breed. The number identified and cataloged by scientists is 2 million species in the planet. And the number of estimates of actual total number on Earth are 5 to 100 million. species. And the most common estimate is 10 million species on Earth. And think about that. We only know 2 million of the species out of 10 at the low end. So there's so many different kinds of organisms we don't even know about. Alright, so what do you think is the most common animal on Earth? Take a second to make a guess. And remember, this is different than asking which animals have the most different species. This is more how abundant. Okay, make your guess. And it's actually nematodes or microscopic roundworms. The amount in mass. It's controversial. It's not for certain, but a lot of studies show that these are probably the most abundant organisms. And because they live they fill the soil. You might think that humans own the planet, but you'd be wrong. Worms like this one in the video are Earth's animal overlords. Nematodes are the most numerically abundant animals on Earth. So consider that the nematode roundworm, the most abundant of all animals. 4 out of 5 animals on Earth are nematode worms. If all solid material except nematodes, worms, were to be eliminated, you could still see the ghostly outline of most of it in nematode worms. Okay, it's been 15 minutes in this video. I want you to pause it, get up, go get some water, breathe through your nose, and take a little break. Otherwise, you're going to not retain the information. You're going to start to slog. So do that, take a break, and then we'll get to the second half of these notes. Pause the video. Okay, and so the most common organism is the bacterium Pelagibacter ubicae. So 1/3 of all single-celled oceanic organisms. There's bacteria everywhere. Everywhere you look in the planet, there's bacteria. Okay, and just to note, these are the different ecosystems in New Mexico. So we have grassland, this Great Basin sagewood, the chaparral, the desert grassland, the pinon juniper wilderness. That's what I'm most familiar with. And just note that you'll hear ecosystem diversity and habitat diversity, and these are the same things. So when we talk about the ecosystem diversity, it's the diversity of the different types of landscapes. So we can talk about diversity in different ways. We talked about diversity with different types of animals or organisms, and this is different types of ecosystems or habitats. And so we have two different major types of species that we can categorize. So we have a generalist species that can live in a huge amount of conditions. And usually these are the type of species that live all over the world, especially since we bring animals all over the world. And they're also animals that live near humans usually. So you can remember generalists by animals that can live by humans really well. And so that would be wolves, rats, pigeons, raccoons, goats, pigs, all these animals that have really adapted to all sorts of conditions in life. And coyotes and raccoons, they eat almost anything, and that would make them a generalist. And then we have a specialist species. And these live under a very narrow range of conditions, or feed on one or a very small group of species. So these guys only eat eucalyptus leaves, the koala bears. So cute. I love them. And the panda bears, they only eat bamboo, and they live in a very specific type of environment. Tiger salamanders here, they can't reproduce unless they live in wetland habitats. So that do not dry out in the spring and summer. And they need an abundance of insects and worms. So it's a very specific environment that they need. So you could imagine that these would be much more vulnerable species compared to a coyote that can live anywhere, right? and some pictures of baby pandas. My friend's the film producer at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., and he gets to film baby pandas for a living. Can you believe that? Okay, so I want you to answer these questions in your packet, pause the video, write them down, really think. This is really good for your learning, so make sure you're doing this. So what impact would habitat loss have on these two categories of species? Which group is in much more danger of extinction? Can you think of a reason why it might be advantageous to be a specialist? And what impact would habitat loss have on animals with large or small territories? Pause the video, go ahead and answer those, and then we'll continue. So, habitat loss is devastating to specialists because they are unable to shift food sources, nesting areas, or other requirements. They are in much more danger of extinction, like I said before. In very crowded biomes like the rainforest, there are more specialists because it is advantageous to become very good at eating one particular type of food or utilizing one particular type of resource. If all of your energy is going to one place, you can outcompete others more easily, and you can have carved yourself out a niche, or a very specific place in the environment. A generalist, meanwhile, may be outcompeted everywhere. Jack of all trades, a master of none. Habitat loss and fragmentation is more harmful to animals that require large territories. Even when there are regions being preserved, they are often not connected effectively for the animals that would need to move among them. So, when an animal needs a huge area, even if it's conserved, sometimes they need to migrate. And even if there's like 500 feet of territory, like a highway or something, that can be enough to cut the animal off from their habitat and cause them a large amount of destruction. Okay? Good. So hopefully you got all that. You can pause and rewind. All right, and we're wrapping this up. 6 more slides. So, the species richness is the number of total species. Total. Not diversity. Just, well, I guess it is diversity, sorry. Diversity. So how many different species live in that area? So you can see the blue areas have a lot of different species, often coastal, a lot of water. Where it's really cold in the north, there's not a lot going on. And so on and so forth. So species richness is the number of total species. And that's the first important way to quantify biodiversity. Species evenness is the abundance of individuals within each species. So evenness gives us more specific information. There might be one or few species dominating many others. And so that's not optimal for an ecosystem, right? It's not balanced. So high evenness is healthier. Ants on a picnic table remind us how there can be many, many more of one particular species than others, even if there is a high total number of species. So we could have a really high number of species, but if one species is like taking up so much of the environment, then that's also really important to know. Okay, that's evenness. And so, which forest do you think is more diverse? Go ahead and answer. Each forest has the same 4 tree species, so it has the same species richness, but they differ in species evenness, so the relative abundance of each species. So they have the same types of trees, you can see that, right? But this one is much more even, right? They all kind of have a good footing, whereas this one is not very even. It's filled with this one tree. Probably the Chinese tree of heaven like they have in Albuquerque. All right, so in community A, the abundance of one species the yellow mushrooms, is high relative to the other species. So this community has low species evenness. But in community B, each species has the same abundance, so this community has high species evenness. Okay, last thing. So this is just so that you know that there's a way that you measure species diversity mathematically, and don't worry, you don't need to know this formula. All you need to see is that there's a mathematical formula that calculates and compares biodiversity using richness and evenness. And Shannon Weiner, you could see that as one of them. And you can feel good about not having to use this one because you will be working with the next one, the Simpson's Diversity Index, which is simpler. Okay, so this is one measurement of species diversity. And this is the one that you will want to be working with. So it's basically the number of species and the abundance of the nth species, the number of species, over the total abundance of each species. So, yeah. We will go over this further, but this is just the beginning of how we calculate how diverse these species are. Don't freak out about this. We're going to go into it more. All right. Hopefully you have you answered your notes. Send me some questions if you have them. I'd love to hear from you. And have a beautiful day.